The Crooked Epic, 1 The Inn of Maniacal Madness, 11, Christopher, the Airplane, 11E, 1. Christopher Good looked into eldritch darkness, utterly impervious to the lake behind him, the burning trees smoking ashes and the stench of death and decaying odors rising along the bluff. His hands began to shake as he brushed the right side of the door gently, testing the architecture and fitting his thumb around the concrete trim. Christopher did not sense any difference between this tall, doorless portal and a Buddhist temple or a Christian mortuary, differing only slightly from the ciborium in the garden. It was designated as a stupa because the intentions of Draken, Toro, and Motu were to complete a bizarre and practically impossible plan to justifiably commit some form of mass atrocity by trapping themselves in the Pandora's box, with the untrue premise of existence within the portal where no such space was ever there before nor would ever be. Identifying the stupa as resembling Buddha's ceremonial gravesite was probably only a passing thought, and the structure was referred to, as was the ciborium, as Pandora's box. The doorway of Pandora's box stood and hovered above the dimmed light of a solar system which the gods denied, and Christopher Good saw as the dusty debris of the cliff sailed out into the abyss of permanent twilight. Those early morning sounds of nature that slowed on earth as the sun began to rise were hushed like a mother's auditory experience during Lamaze. Like that, Christopher Good breathed heavily as he stepped through the portal. Beyond it, his eyes saw the falling waves of the enormous ocean. The white tips crashed in a perfect mimic of our beaches on Earth, and although there was no sand, the rocks along the shoreline rose and fell like dunes. The sound of each tidal splash, sucking and swelling, neatly hid the crackling fire which spread shimmering sparkles across the serene ambiance and danced before Christopher's eyes. It was the voice of his son, Alexander Good, which broke the spell of enchantment. Christopher wondered if the call was from the ocean or a siren calling him to a grave in the Sea of Nob. But when he turned around, Christopher Good saw his own son, Alex, and Agent Constantini holding his own heinously destroyed skull in his two hands near his stomach, standing with a gaping wound on his neck and along both of his clavicles where he had been previously decapitated. Constantini smiled with blood smearing his teeth and let his head fall into his left hand to swing by his head. He pointed to Christopher Good as he screamed, and Mr. Good screamed. Alex just spat out a choking laugh. At first, Christopher was confused at the presence of his son. How had he appeared now? But the military garb he was adorned with, as well as complicity with the estranged agent, was enough to warn him that this was not his biological offspring. There was not much fracas before Christopher Good ran out of breath, and the other agent, Esposito, rushed from behind. Much like the eighth stupa of Buddha's followers, Pandora's box had fallen into a heap of minerals, clay, and ashes. Someone else, too, had appeared from the Vigentilian side of the portal, though. Alexander began to spasm as Agent Esposito tackled Mr. Good to the ground. Esposito and Alex were unconcerned, and although they had been strengthened by the powerful chemicals induced into their brains through the sacks attached to their necks, Christopher Good had continued to wrestle violently, jabbing with his elbows and biting any part of their persons which came within reach of his arms, mouth, and body. As the dark shadow of someone drew closer to the fire pit of the crumbled portal, fueled by a small amount of the power source, it hesitated in lurching and stuttering fright. Meanwhile, the power of the Pandora's boxes became unstable, and the two attackers became fearfully aware of the strange reaction made by the enigmatic teleportation device's integration of cursed, endemic food of damnation. Draken's course of action was simple and effective, but they did not affect the mortal soul of Christopher Good, nor his most recently acquired companion. The ramification of a built flame upon only a single molecule of the energy source of this planet was like a flickering spark causing an atomic reaction large enough to create a high-order explosion so large as to destroy all physical matter in an 80-foot radius. However, destructive properties became magnified and centralized during the strained atmospheric pressures. The result was an astonishing amount of radiation which created a mixed miniature nova on the shoreline, sending water fizzling back into the ocean and claiming only the lives of Alexander's clone and the deformed and misshapen body of Agent Constantini. It shined so brightly it scarred Esposito's eyes. Still, the stranger in the night and Christopher had chosen wisely to close their eyes in painful horror at the awful sight of the Pandora box's unexplained internal deterioration. It was partly due to the sacrifice in elementals' convergence and partly due to the destabilized ear in the atmosphere. When he reopened his eyes, Christopher Good had retained almost all his vision and was surprised to see the radiation's effulgent glow, effectively lighting the surrounding 50-yard area. The suffering, writhing body of Esposito was not lucky. He had permanently burned his eyes through his optic nerves and into his brain, instantly sending piercing pain throughout his body. He was crying out. The produced noise was a choking reflex. Christopher stood slowly to his feet and saw the boy he had come through the other side of the portal. He stood naked and hairless, severely burned, shivering with trauma, blinking back the terrible, hopeless feeling fought by soldiers in wars had never overcome. It was Jacob, the neighbor from the north who had climbed through the tunnel from Muir's cave into the land of Hob. He had followed Christopher and the pilots into the tunnel and through the church area's Pandora. But the poor boy was shaken, and when Mr. Good approached him, concerned, his eyes shot wide open, and he turned and ran away faster than a ghost. Christopher Good watched him hide further down the shore and duck behind a large boulder, thrown by the explosion to a position which made it appear like the Sinaran Devil's Stair Steps or of the Mesa Desert. Christopher Good knew the child was from where, but undoubtedly had difficulty recognizing him. His knees wobbled and his legs felt like the bones had been shattered, but he was unhurt and merely temporarily paralyzed. He began to try to sing a lullaby in almost mother-like and instinctive self-determination, but all the sounds he made were forced and did not make a speech or translatable sense. He began to sway rhythmically, side to side as he hummed. Then the canines barked again, filling the sky with the same noises which killed his pilots, echoing from above the ocean. So Christopher Good retained his humming and opened his eyes wide, too, staring at the confused boy. He began to cover his ears and take his hands back away, and he did this 3 times, hoping the kid behind the rocks would interpret it as a sign to prepare himself for the horror thrusting itself down from the sky. Jacob, though, did not catch the initially intended persuasive tactics. As Christopher closed his palms closely over his earlobes the 4th time, the dog's howl began to devour Jacob's soul as it swallowed the beach and sent panic into the hearts of the dying agent. Finally, at the last second, Jacob pushed himself under the boulder. He began to cover his eyes, weeping, and in haphazard coincidence decided to cover his ears too, saving him from the almost complete devastation of his mind and sure death. Christopher held himself up and kept his eyes open while Esposito died in agony. When Jacob reopened his eyes under the boulder, the sound had become a low and muffled growl, strangely echoing under the rock's surface. He was still in shock as he looked around the overhanging edges of the space and saw the dog's face forcing itself from the wall, biting and gnashing its teeth savagely. Christopher Good had no momentum to use yet, and fell backward on the ground as Jacob stumbled out of the rock and began shuffling hurriedly to a place further away, shrouded in endless night. So the father of the 2 American-born children stayed on his back, laying with no sleep, mumbling something which to his ears sounded like prayers of Christianity, or maybe something which came directly from his soul without religion. His eyes stared into the dark sky, and his mind raced, reimagining the spirit would fly into the space of this disintegrating dimension.